Hi, good morning, guys. Thank you for taking time off your very busy schedules to be here for my presentation. I know we usually don't have titles, but I have a title, so I'll tell you guys anyway. It's A History Without Turning Points, Methodological Insights from Colonial Officers' Diaries in the Bodleian Library's holdings. So today I'll be talking about what historians of Africa, especially new entrants to the field of African history like myself, can learn looking at these diaries, right? Usually when graduate students, you are going through graduate school, you are told to go into the archives as a historian and look for nuggets of information about turning points in history, right? So you usually focus on the big events, right? And you look for changes in colonial policy or a moment that shows how riot was slowly brewing under the currents and eventually burst out into the open, right? And what that usually does is that it constricts historical time into major events. So if you take Ghana's colonial history, for instance, right? You go into the archives and you're always looking for peculiar events which demonstrate something you can use to show as a bigger version of what was already happening but was under the scene. But you never really get a sense of what the under the scene really is until you look deeper and you are supposed to read against the grain and do all sorts of convulsions in the archive. So that history that compresses historical time into major events cannot, for instance, tell us about the fervor and mood of events, right? Or the private opinions of the men who staffed the colonial bureaucracy, for instance. Likewise, we cannot feel how boring their job was and the tedious repetition of everyday activities that allowed these officials into a dangerous complacency. So if you look at diaries on the other hand, it gives texture to archival moments when something finally happened and complacency gave way to confused inaction and a scrambling about. So something like a murder, right, a strike, a riot, or a violent attack on a community is an important moment that would be noted in the archive. But you really won't get the feel of that because, official correspondences tend to be matter of fact, right, without giving any, background detail or information. And the paradox is that the archives also depict a world where colonial officials were constantly busy and they were always inspecting one project or another, or inspecting a road, or writing confidential minutes and responding to reports and doing all sorts of things, right? So it is easy as historians to take for granted that sometimes between the archival pages, sometimes months and even years happened, right? So you could be studying a phenomenon like armed robberies in Colonial Asante, and you'd be chasing archival folders, and you wouldn't realize that it took about 3 months for one official to respond to a query because he probably minuted that he was going to get back to it, and he never did, right? So sometimes you lose that sense of time, right? And I think it's something that exists in Asante historiography and other historiographies in African history. So in Asante history, colonial time typically begins in 1891 with the British offer of protection to the Asantehene, and then it moves on to how the Asantehene turned this offer down, and then in 1896, from 1891, the next major event is the British invasion of Asante, the exiling of the Asantehene, and then the next major event is 4 years later when we have the famous Asantewaa War and how Asante was defeated, and then in 1902, Asante is incorporated into the British Empire formally, right? After that, we jump to 1921, which is the next major event, the desecration of the Golden Stool, which is the symbol of Asante's statehood. Then after that, the next major event is Prempeh's repatriation in 1924. Then his restoration as King of Kumasi, the capital, in 1926. His death in 1931, the ascension of his successor in 1931, and then the restoration of the monarchy in 1935. So major events, right? And the question that follows is, what happened between these major events, right? Because I'm a historian, I need to trace, society, the progression of society through all these events, right, to know what's really happened. In other words, why is the mundane as important as, the big events, right, to the historiographical narrative I'm trying to present as a historian? And the answer is very simple, right? when you look at archival testimonies of historical actors and even newspaper testimonies, right, you find people saying times have changed, right? So then you wonder, how did these historical actors know that times had indeed changed, right? And you realize that they actually know times have changed by looking over the incremental events of their life over a long period of time. They don't just limit themselves to the big events, right? So then through that you realize that the small events of our lives also matter, right? So then as historians you wonder, how do I also bring into the narrative the small events of, you know, the historical past, which we cannot go because we do not have a time machine, right? So historical writing is very fragmentary. We don't have the sources, we don't have a time machine. What do we do, right? This morning I want to introduce you to the diaries of two colonial officials, right, who served in the Gold Coast, which is what Ghana was called before independence in 1957. The first set of diaries here, 7 of them, are for John Maxwell, and then these ones are for A.C. Duncan-Johnstone, right? Now, I want you to just contrast and compare, you know, on your own time. I'm sure they'll be here for a while, so, you know, you can take a look. But according to a short biography, which is reprinted from the Dumfries and Galloway Standard, Sir John Maxwell was born on the 6th of September 1875 at Maxwell Town in Kirkcudbrightshire. He was educated at the Dumfries Academy and Glasgow University. He qualified as a solicitor in 1899. Unfortunately, he did not have any money to set up his own practice. And as fate would have it, just at that time, he saw an advert in a newspaper saying, well, we need men, you know. If you walk on the high street, you see a sign and someone saying, I need you, you know, like Uncle Sam. And the king needed him, well, Queen Victoria needed him at the time. So he decided to sign up for, you know, the colonial service. He was posted to the Gold Coast. His idea was that, look, I'm going here to make money and come back and set up my own practice, right? But he got in there and he saw that the work was good and the conditions were excellent and the pay was, you know, good. And he figured I could make a career out of this. So he stayed. He started as an assistant district commissioner in 1902. 2 months later, he was promoted to a full district commissioner. A series of rapid promotions later, and he was acting district commissioner for Takwa, which is an important mining district where we got all the gold and diamonds. So that showed the level of trust they had in him. By 1911, he was colonial secretary for the Gold Coast, governor's deputy in 1916, Deputy Chief Commissioner in 1921, Secretary for Native Affairs in 1923, and acting governor at various points in the 1920s. He was knighted in 1930, the year he retired. The Bodleian has 21 volumes of diaries, which are from 1909 to 1903. So we don't have the first 7 years of his service in the Gold Coast. And the diary entries allow us to see Maxwell's everyday routine as a high-ranking official in a pacified and peaceful colony. He usually woke up at 7, or sometimes earlier than that, between 6 and 7. He surprisingly almost never ate breakfast. I don't know why. Lunch was at midday. He usually took supper alone, but sometimes with friends and colleagues. He typically went to bed between 10 and 11. During his work hours, he responded to letters and queries in his office. He received delegations of chiefs. He called on friends and colleagues and played golf, a sport he self-admittedly never got a hang of. So diaries like Maxwell's are important because they allow historians to access the thoughts and feelings of individual subjects across historical time for revisions or corroborations of broad historical interpretations and narratives. For instance, as I mentioned, Ghana's Colonial Archive depicts a world where the work was busy and exacting, and it seems Maxwell agreed. Let no one imagine, he declares in the biography in the Dumfries and Galloway Standard, that the life of a commissioner consists mainly of playing tennis under the palm trees. Those who wish to do their work well must spend long, weary days in traveling to inspect roads, to visit schools, to see after the postal service, the police, and the 1,001 details of administration that fill up the day's work of a commissioner. His nights are occupied in drawing up reports and preparing schemes of further development. His diaries confirm this, but also tell me that he spent a lot of time playing golf. But he worked on Saturdays, and you can't get me to work on a Saturday, so maybe he was hardworking. But at the same time, the entries also consistently note how humdrum and tiring it all was for him, right? He would go to bed and he would be complaining, I'm tired, it's boring. And unlike Duncan-Johnstone's diaries, Maxwell's diaries barely mention any Africans. Those that appear are chiefs and, educated intelligentsia. Even his cooks and stewards are absent, which is strange. And I think nonetheless, the diaries provide valuable insider perspectives into early 20th century colonial circles in Accra. We see, for instance, how the routine of everyday activity possibly contributed to the emergence of a new African civil society that propped up colonial rule for a while. I say for a while because educated Africans followed the lead of their white compatriots to form clubs, associations, and societies where they discussed history, politics, and other important issues of the day. These clubs and societies formed the nucleus of the political parties that would ride on the wave of the nationalist consciousness that arose in the 1920s and 30s to lead the Gold Coast, now Ghana, to independence in 1957. Thank you.